Well, as the basis for our thinking together this morning, I want to read two passages from the Bible. Put together, I think they offer a really important way to think about lives of discipleship as we move into this brand new year. The first passage comes from the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2. And I know you find these words familiar as I begin. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Darkness covered the deep, while a wind from God, some translations say a spirit from God, swept over the face of the earth. The very beginning of the Bible. Then, as Jesus is beginning his ministry in Luke chapter 5, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats out in the shore, beyond the shore of the lake, where the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. The one belonged to Simon, and Jesus asked him to put out a little bit from the shore. There, in the boat, Jesus sat down. Side note, they were on the water, which acted like a sound reflector. They didn't have peak public address systems in those days. So to address the size of the crowd, he pushed out and used the water as the public address system. And in those days, it was the custom of the teacher to sit when teaching. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water." The deep. "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boats to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, my Lord, for I am a sinful person." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the vast catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. When I graduated from high school, I thought I knew just about everything. And I was a little concerned that some of my parents didn't seem to know as much as I did. But I particularly thought I knew a little bit of everything about the Bible and the Christian faith because I grew up in a disciples' church in a small town on the edge of the Ozarks that for size and vitality was about the same size as Hazelwood was in those days. And we had first-rate Bible instruction. So when I went to college and sat down in my first class, it was a class in Introduction to the Bible. And the professor said, we're going to begin at the beginning. Genesis 1 and 2. And you know how these things happen in your mind. I've heard that. I know what that is. It's time for a nap. But before my eyes closed, the professor laid out before me a new way of thinking about Genesis 1 and 2. I had thought that before God began to create the world, there was nothing, and that God created the world out of nothing. Whereas my professor pointed out that in Genesis 1 and 2, it is very clear that when God began to create, there was already something, but it was a chaos. It was not a world with form and purpose. It was an energy that was unfocused and turning on itself in a destructive, self-destructive way. I'll bet there's not a person here who is old enough to remember black and white movies. But I remember as a younger person, you remember black and white movies? Well, then you may have seen the one, not only black and white, but silent. Silent movies. Well, I was once watching a documentary on the history of the cinema, and they brought on a silent black and white of Tugboat Annie. And at first, all you could see was Tugboat Annie in her tugboat setting out to sea. And the tugboat was going up and down, and her little cap was going up and down. But as she got farther into the water, the waves became bigger, and the screen began more and more dim. And soon all you could see was the shadow of the tugboat roiling up and down in the waters, flashes of lightning which illuminated great mounds of water with foam at the top pouring down on the tugboat. Chaos. Water, unfocused, bent upon destroying itself. That's the way the writer of Genesis pictured the world as God created. God took this deep sea, the depth, that was foaming and groaning and lashing against itself, and out of it began to make a world. First a little light and dark, then a little land, then some animals, finally human beings and life as we know it. If this were, wait, what tell me, I would ask you the question, where else in the Bible do you hear this type of language? Depths, void. Where else do you hear that? It doesn't always come through in the English, but it comes through in the Hebrew as you read through the Old Testament and realize that these writers use the image of the primeval sea, the image of the formless void, the image of the power crashing against itself as a symbol for the chaos that the people of Israel experience at different moments in their history. They walk in darkness. God speaks to the deep. God promises to lead them through that deep. There was the exile in Assyria, when the Assyrian Empire rolled over from the north, and for 200 years Israel lived in exile, and the writers described it as being in a chaos. 200 years later, the Babylonians came up and over the Fertile Crescent, poured into the land of Israel, destroyed the infrastructure, invaded Jerusalem, burned the temple, and it was to them as if they were again in the deep. I'll bet you feel like you are in the deep sometimes too. Right now, that war in Ukraine, you see the pictures of those bombed out powerhouses. You see the pictures of those people living in ruins. And not far from the back of my mind is the question, could that happen here? There are the partisan politics in our country, the people grouped around certain ideas and people shouting at one another. No civility, no respect, no treating the other person as a person of dignity. And the most frightful thing of all is that I fear slipping into this myself. After the George Foreman incident, when George Foreman was killed and the Black Lives Matter took root and flowered for a time, I thought we may have the possibility here to make our way into a better era of understanding and reconciliation among the races. I work each Tuesday afternoon at a food bank in Indianapolis. It's a motorized food bank, a long garage with food stations along the way, and people drive their cars through, and the volunteers just put food in the cars, one after another, sometimes so fast you can barely keep up with it. When I started, we were seeing about 400 to 500 households a day, but now it's up to 600 and pushing 700 households a day. Why are so many people short of food? And there's personal anxiety. I wonder, if I were a parent, I'd be wondering what my child is doing on the internet. I'm 73 years old. Sometimes I wonder, what is that pain and where might it lead? Scholars agree that the leaders of Israel who wrote the book of Genesis during the exiles began to speak to the people in the language of chaos to assure them in the midst of their own experiences of uncertainty that the power of God that preserved the chaos, the wind that swept over the water, the Spirit that kept it all in God's hands, is still there, alive and at work, even when, especially when, they do not feel it. And when Jesus is on the lake, beginning his ministry, seeking disciples to carry his message, the first thing he does is go to the seashore, and he sees people fishing in a boat. And they fished all night, and their nets are empty, and you know that feeling when you've given it your best, and it just doesn't happen. And he says to them, put down your nets into the deep. Put down your nets, not just into the water, put down your nets into the chaos that is so often just below the surface of life, and see what you pull up. They were tired. They were done. They could not believe he asked them to put their nets down into the very thing that threatened them. but when they did what Jesus said. When they did what Jesus said, the nets came up more full than they could imagine. They could hardly process the harvest that they brought up from the sea. And this is one of the pictures that the gospel writers use to describe the nature of the mission of the church. To put down your net into the chaos, because it is a net that comes from Jesus and is powered by the Holy Spirit, and see what it can bring up, even in an unexpected way. Put down your net and see what happens in 2023. Only yesterday, it seems, we had 5 children at our house. At the time, they were ages 13, 9, 6, 6, and 3. My wife, Linda, was serving a congregation as an interim, so on Sunday morning, she would get in the car and drive to some far-off, safe place. Whereas I was at home getting these 5 children together and getting them over to church. You aren't dressed. You know you get dressed before breakfast. Where did you put your clothes? No, I can't make French toast this close to timing to go. The pitcher of orange juice turns over, the box of Cheerios empties on the floor, and I am fit to be tied. What we have right there is a picture of chaos. Well, on this particular Sunday, I was the deacon, one of the deacons, and my responsibility was to prepare the Lord's table. So I packed them up. We went to church. I got the bread out and began to cut it up, and I got them busy cutting up the bread. And we had communion trays to fill. Now, some of you may not know this, but when you have a communion tray with little cups in it, there's a gadget you use. You pour grape juice in a little holder, and there's a needle and a thumb instrument, and you put a little bit of grape juice in each one of these little cups. In the imagination of a 6-year-old child, a bread cube is for one thing. No, 2 things. One is eating, the other is throwing. And how easy it is to convert the instrument that fills the communion cups into a squirt gun. Grape juice on a white shirt. By the time we got to the Lord's table, I was myself a quivering body of chaos. Rustle, rustle, itch, itch. Can I go to the bathroom? But they played the hymn. I got up, took my place at the front, beside the sacred table. The elder, as God is my witness, prayed, O mothering God, may the wings of your Spirit hover over this bread and this cup and make them reminders of your presence, even in the midst of our confusion. How could I forget? If I had been on the shore of the primordial deep at the beginning of Genesis 1, would I have seen the world that God could bring forth? If I had been in exile in Babylon, could I have imagined God present there with me, and not only that, but leading us home to Jerusalem? If I had been there on the shore of Galilee, Could I have imagined the harvest that the disciples of Jesus would bring up when they put their nets down into the chaos of the world? If I had paid attention to God with those 5 snapping children, would I have seen the potential that they have become as adults? I don't know. What I do know is that when we do what Jesus says, when we put our nets down into the most unlikely places, we never know what will come up. But when the disciples did, they brought up nets that were so full they could not imagine them.